Earlier this month, England's National Health Service released the findings of a 4-year study commissioned to review the gender services provided for children and young people. The final report, written by leading pediatrician Dr. Hilary Cass, made clear both the damage caused by these practices as well as a lack of evidence behind the recommendation of these procedures. English officials appear to recognize the significance of the Cass report and now prohibit most of these gender procedures on children. But many on the left have doubled down on their cause. Dr. Cass has been forced to avoid public transportation due to security concerns. And the activist group GLAAD continues to insist the science on this topic is settled in their direction, targeting journalists who accurately report the shaky foundation behind these practices. Now, will there be a breakthrough where mainstream organizations in the U.S. recognize the harm caused by these procedures? Joining me now to discuss it is Walt Heyer. He's a senior fellow at the Family Research Council and founder of sexchangeregret.com. Walt, good to see you today.
Yeah, Joseph, thanks for having me on. It's a great topic, one of my favorite topics.
Well, and there are a few people better to discuss it than you. And before we get into the Cass report, I want to give you a chance to share your story with those who may not be familiar briefly.
Yeah, I'm one of those people who struggled early on. In fact, Joseph, it was 79 years ago. I was a cross-dressing young boy in 1944. And the fact that my grandmother made me a purple chiffon dress and affirmed me in the dress, told me how cute I was and so forth, I can tell you that's child abuse. It's emotional and psychological child abuse. And that's a practice all of us need to stop. And it's harmed me. I wouldn't be talking about it at 83 years old about something that happened to me when I was 4. Unless it had a great deal of harm. And it caused my life 50 years of struggle with my identity. Yeah. And ended up going through the hormone procedures, went through the surgical procedures, ended up identifying as a female for 8 years as a result of my grandmother putting me in a purple chiffon dress and some other incidents that happened when I was young, including being sexually and physically abused.
Now, it seems, at least in England, their national health services have done some research that seems to support the experience that you've lived through, which is transitioning people chemically and surgically, especially children, does not actually relieve the mental distress that these so-called treatments are intended to fix, to solve. What's your reaction to that research?
Well, I know the research is correct because, as you mentioned, I'm the founder of sexchangeregret.com, and that's been nearly 14 years ago. And the fact of the matter is that people have been writing me asking for help after they've taken hormones and had surgery, and all of them, 100% of them, report being harmed by the hormones and surgery. In fact, what we recognize today is, Joseph, is that hormones devalue a person, and the surgery destroys people. So we're just devaluing people and destroying them. And so people they don't change their gender. That's the other critical thing is that the hormones and surgery has never changed anybody's gender. We're dealing with an identity issue. And that something happened to these individuals early in life that caused them to not like who they are. And it's not even about gender.
Yeah. Well, despite the anger from some activists directed at Dr. Cass, this has actually led to change in the UK, which seems remarkable that the NHS has, as we like to say these days, followed the science, and they've actually changed their behavior. But on this side of the pond, we've seen resistance to that, and in many cases, LGBT activists who insist that chemical and surgical modifications as a treatment for what they refer to as gender dysphoria is still the right path. What's your reaction to that?
Well, obviously, it's not the right path. I mean, England had a report back in 2004 out of the University of Birmingham that actually said many of the same things that the Cass report says. So we've known about the harm being done in England, reported it in their studies years ago. In fact, it even reported in that study, it was University of Birmingham reported that people are more likely to commit suicide after undergoing hormones and surgery. That was July 2004. Was reported in the UK Guardian by David Batty. So the research it continues to destroy the idea that you can change your gender, that it's helpful. It's always been harmful. I mean, the first notice about the harm being done was in 1978 here in this country. And so Dr. Charles L. Ihlenfeld, who worked for 6 years at a gender clinic, the Benjamin Gender Clinic in New York, reported that hormones were causing too much harm and too many ended up committing suicide. That was in 1979. So these studies keep coming out. And here's my own life experience saying I attempted suicide within a few weeks after undergoing the procedure. And thanks to the good Lord redeeming my life, I'm here. But the fact of the matter is these stories, Joseph, continue to come out, and they gain a little bit of traction, and then they kind of get covered up again. So I think it's important for us to keep the pedal to the metal and keep pushing and telling the truth, and like you're doing today, and put these stories out about the harm being done, because it's all destroying lives. That's what it does.
Yeah. Well, with respect to that scenario you just described there, where they gain a little traction, then they get covered up again, the Cass report addressed that a bit, and they talked about the fear that many doctors have with discussing this topic. And here's a quote that I want to let you react to. He said, there are a few other areas of healthcare where professionals are so afraid to openly discuss their views, and where people are vilified on social media, and where name-calling echoes the worst bullying behavior. This must stop. End quote. Now, what's your reaction to their apparent acknowledgement that open, honest discussion about this topic is not tolerated in many quarters?
Well, I can tell you on a personal level, my own doctor, who is afraid to talk about, she knows my whole story. She knows from looking at my books and looking at other materials I have online. And she has actually prayed with me when I've been in there for guidance from her. And she said she can't talk about it. She can't tell anybody where she is because she's in a large medical institution. So yes, it's true. And here's another thing. Everybody has to sort of clam up about this, and we need more people to step up and keep pushing and being stronger about it. And we're gonna win the battle because the information's there, and we can crush these people who keep trying to redo and say that it's helpful.
Yeah. This issue does seem to be uniquely emotional, given the nature of what's happening. You are either providing permanent long-term help, or you are creating permanent long-term harm. By the nature of these so-called treatments, you are doing something that is irreversible. And so to that point, recognizing that that's just true, whether you think it's helpful or not helpful, do you think this is an issue where the implications of being wrong are so horrible that some people will never be willing to admit that possibility, regardless of how much evidence there is? Therefore, we could have 100 Cass reports all reaching the same conclusions, and we're still going to deal with a passionate, motivated, kind of parental group and medical group that is not willing to consider the possibility that they made mistakes because of what that would mean about their decisions and how that impacted children.
Well, absolutely, Joseph. I mean, consider where we are today. If people on the inside that have been doing these procedures and harming people, what would they do if they start admitting that they know the harm? In fact, one of the Marcy Bowers, I even talked to Marcy Bowers through email one time about one of my clients, and she's not about to say anything. She's making $1,300,000 or $1.5 million a year doing these procedures. So the people are too invested financially in making these lies about the fact that it's helping people, and they really don't care about the consequences. And until such time as we see, 23 states now have banned it, and until we see more lawsuits where medical malpractice cases affect the doctors in a negative way, I think that's probably going to be where the end comes. It's going to be through medical malpractice cases, because they're not going to admit it on their own, Joseph.
Well, and that was my follow-up question, because you have expressed some optimism long-term on this issue that eventually we will come to our senses and realize this is not helpful. You do think that that's not going to happen necessarily politically, but through the legal system, where lawyers are essentially going to come to the defense of these children, and that's going to shut it down?
I don't know about shutting it down. I think there's going to be, there's always going to be people out there doing this, because it's just the way people are. But I do think that the medical malpractice is going to affect this in a negative way. I've even seen cases now where, the medical malpractice fees, because of these states saying you can't do this to children anymore, their medical malpractice fees are going up so high, doctors won't do the procedures. So I think that's another side to this that is exposing how bad it is when the people are saying, your medical malpractice thing might be $700,000 a year or whatever it is. I don't know, that's not an accurate number, but just as an example. And the doctor said, I can't afford it, so I can't go into this practice.
Yeah. Well, Walt, we know your story, and the Cass report clearly documents the fact that that's not unique. Still, we can find people today who would say, this saved my life. I absolutely needed that procedure, and without it, I would be dead in some way. What's your response to those people who are still, on a personal level, saying this was critical for me, therefore it should be available for others?
Yeah, Joseph, I've had people that have written me, and they've said very horrible things, take down your website, because, it really worked for me. And I've had them write me back 2, 3, 4 years later and say, Walt, I need your help. This was a mistake. So I think until we have 20 to 25 years of experience with each individual and see what their outcomes are, I think we're going to continue to see people are going to raise up and say, no, this isn't working. But even though there's people saying it does, all we need to do is wait a few years and we'll find out that it doesn't work. Because I've had them, Joseph, report to me 40 years after the surgical procedure and the hormones, say they wished they would have admitted that they were wrong 20 years before instead of suffering for an additional 20 years.
Well, the legislative efforts on this really have focused on children. And the idea has been that adults should be allowed to do what adults want to do. And if that includes mutilating your body or taking hormones, cross-sex hormones, you should be allowed to do that. Do you think that's the right approach politically, legislatively?
Personally, I don't think so. I wish there would have been some guardrails up there for me. When you go in 1981, I go into a doctor who was one of the original chairpersons who wrote the standards of care, the WPATH standards of care, diagnosed me in 1981 with gender dysphoria. And I had told him my whole life story about the abuses and so forth that went on. And he says, well, you need hormones and surgery. Well, I look back at that, and that is so insane. The fact of the matter is, Joseph, in every single individual that I personally worked with, sat down and spent time with in helping them, they admit that they never had gender dysphoria, that it was something else. They had adverse childhood experiences, or they suffered some deep depression because of their parents' divorce, or because they moved, or because they had an illness themselves, or their dad was incarcerated, or whatever. Their mom died in a plane crash. All these things are traumatizing to young people, and they're trying to treat trauma and early childhood abuse with hormones and surgery, which is like barbaric. This is Frankenstein stuff. This is absolutely insane. There isn't any child for the purpose of changing genders who needs hormones and surgery. They need good psychotherapy to deal with the underlying psychological issues that are causing them to not like who they are. Let's find out what they are and actually deal with those issues and prevent them from having hormones and surgery. And that will not harm them for the rest of their life. It will actually help them. So I think, there's there's just too many people out there that are unwilling to step up and say, this is harmful. And there's too many results. You've seen them. I've seen them.
Yeah.
The CAS report's got it too.
In about 30 seconds, what's your advice to people who may be dealing with people in their family struggling with this question right now?
Yeah, I think we can all step back, and if we have somebody who's struggling with this, take a look at their early childhood, or if they're drinking, if they have alcohol issues, if they're stuck on pornography, if they had a real difficult childhood. Let's talk about your childhood. Let's talk about your addiction. Let's talk about pornography. All of these things affect you in a negative way, and I know that this is the pathway to taking hormones and surgery as a way to try to kill the pain, because I did it, tried to kill the pain of early childhood addictions, trauma, and abuse.
Walt Heyer, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom.
You're welcome.